So, oh, okay, if we are ready, let me introduce our speaker. Dr. Juhem Navarro Rivera is a political scientist who specializes in American and comparative political behavior. He's currently the political research director and managing partner of Socio-Analytica Research, a consulting firm that provides help to organizations and businesses that are led by or serve people of color and minority-led organizations with research and analysis tools that help them better fulfill their missions. As a scholar, Dr. Navarro Rivera is interested in the intersection of race, religion, and politics in the US. He's an expert in the political behavior of secular Americans and on Latinx political behavior. He's known as a leader in secular studies with publications that include many articles, book chapters, columns, and research reports on issues of politics, race, and secularism in the United States and overseas or internationally. His research has appeared in national and international media, including The Washington Post, NBC Latino, O Globo, Brazil, The Times of London, and Reforma Mexico. He's a senior fellow at the Institute of Humanist Studies and serves on the editorial boards of Secularism and Non-Religion and Secular Studies. He serves on the board of directors of the American Humanist Association, which is where I met him and got to know him quite well. And he co-chairs the Latinx Humanist Alliance. It's my pleasure to introduce my friend, Juhem Navarro Rivera.
Thank you, Howard. I'm not muted, right? Okay, no. You and I have been talking about doing this for a while. Finally, we got the chance of doing it, and really appreciate it. It means a lot to me. You're my favorite person in the board. I usually tell this to people on the board when I talk to them, but not to you. And not really. I really like Howard a lot, and it really means to me a lot to me to be talking to his local group. And also because, the Chicago area is also one of my favorite places. It's the first place I lived in the U.S. after I moved from college in Puerto Rico. So it's one of my favorite places in the States. And these talks come from, I started in this, I wouldn't call it business, but certainly in this area of expertise by accident about 13 years ago. And starting doing research on the knowns. And one of the things that has been lacking for a long time, and I think it's changing a little bit now, it's understanding how the politics of the knowns are shaping the country and have been changing over the last decade or so, since this boom of the people with no religion actually increasing and the secularization of the country. I started that back in 2007, 2008, and now with running my own business since 2017, I've been using some of my time and resources to actually continue this kind of endeavor, including some of the data I'll be talking today, which is from a study I did with my firm, Socio-Analytica Research, called the Secular Voices Survey. So it's a nationally representative survey of all Americans, who I actually use a subsample of people who identified as non-religious to do some follow-up questions on some particular subjects. And so you're going to see part of that in here. But I'm going to devote it in three main subjects. One is demographic change, and some things that I think people maybe know, but they're not quite obvious about the non-religious population. And when I talk about the non-religious, I mean people who identify as, in surveys, as atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. That's what I mean by the knowns, so to speak. Then I'm going to go into political participation and trying to talk about some aspects of secular and known political participation that I think are misleading and that some people don't really grasp them. There's a lot of, I don't want to use misinformation because that has taken a whole different life of its own in terms of like the larger body politic, but there's some misconceptions about non-religious Americans and political participation that I've been trying to address, especially in the last year as people, as the election was going underway and the campaigns were going underway. And some of them I addressed in a column that I had during the election season at the Humanists.com that was Non-Decision 2020. And then I want to close with some public opinion trends that the secular community are actually shaping, and that even when, interestingly, the Pew report on Faith on the Hill that they do every 2 years when Congress starts session, and the religious identifications of members of Congress, in which there's only one openly humanist member of Congress, Representative Huffman of California. So definitely this demographic, the non-religious demographic and non-theistic demographic is certainly underrepresented. But that doesn't mean that culturally and politically it's actually powerless. There's some changes that we can show some or give some attribution to the non-religious people. So I'm going to start with the demographic change, and this first chart actually shows the distribution, the sex distribution of the secular population in 2008 and 2018. In 2008, it was when my colleagues and I did the American Religious Identification Survey. That was a survey, we got a lot of, I think the knowns became a thing in the press and in research after that survey, after we showed that 15% of Americans had no religious affiliation. And back in those days, it was a mostly male population. I think the only other group that had, back in 2008, such a gender or sex disparity in their population were Jehovah's Witnesses, who were mostly women. It had a similar distribution where it was 60% women and 40% male. In the case of secular population, it was 60 and 40. And in 2018, I'm using this data from the American Values Atlas that is an annual project by the Public Religion Research Institute. It shows that in just a decade, that gap between men and women identifying as secular has dropped in half. So now we have a more balanced sex distribution, sex identity distribution among the non-religious Americans. This is really interesting because usually when we think about non-religious, the image that comes certainly in the press and the people that get interviewed for stories are usually men. But in reality, a lot of the growth of the secular population, which now, depending on which source you're using, ranges from like 26 to 31% of the American population. A lot of that growth comes from women. And that's something that we don't really talk much about. The other thing is that the knowns are actually more racially diverse and have a racial diversity that better reflects the country's distribution that the two other major Christian religions are the two dominant Christian religions in the country. So, for example, in the case of Catholics, and this is I'm using here the comparative congressional electoral study, which is another very large biennial survey, although they have some annual versions. But it's mostly conducted every election year, and it shows that the non-religious actually have a racial or an ethnic distribution that is similar to the American population. So 2/3 are identified as white, about 12% identify Black or Latinx, and then you have 8% other, which is kind of similar to the U.S. adult population, because of course, like the children population in the United States is actually more people of color than the actual adult population at this point. But Catholics, for example, are less white than the general population overall, but it actually much more Latinx, of course, because of historical reasons. And then the Protestant population is both more white and more black than the population as a whole. And again, this wasn't the case a decade ago. It was closer to 70 or more than 70% of the secular population was white. 3 decades ago was over 80%. And so a lot of the growth in the secular population, which again is attributed to a lot of young people. People call them millennials, but as a millennial adjacent person, was born in 78, not technically in 80, but whose life experiences are closer to a millennial than to a Gen Xer. You know, a lot of the growth is not coming anymore from millennials. Millennials are like, you know, in their 30s now. And essentially it's coming from, you know, Gen Z or whatever we're calling these post-millennial generation. But that post-millennial generation and even the millennial generation are much more diverse than the people who came before them. And that diversity is reflected in the demographics of the secular population overall. And this is another thing that we don't talk much about. Even I have presentations in universities with other scholars that don't even realize that this is happening, that they still have their white, male, atheists as their default view of what the secular population looks like, when it actually looks really much like the American population, and it has much more women that we think that it has had previously, and that essentially the growth is driven in many ways by women and people of color at this point. And then, of course, you know, just a little bit of the age, but if we look at the 3 main religion cohorts again, nearly 3 in 10 non-religious persons are under the age of 30. And in fact, 2/3 are under the age of 50. If you look at the Catholics and you look at the Protestants, the majority of those populations are actually over the age of 50. And in the case of Protestants, like nearly 30% are over the age of 65. So there's a demographic replacement coming in here, in which like the secular population is growing younger, and the religious population, particularly the Christian population, is actually aging much faster. And that could also have repercussions for the country, as I will show as we get into the political sections. And I always like to show these charts because, of course, the nones are often considered the mirror image of the white evangelicals in terms of their politics, in terms of how they vote, and certainly in terms of how they look in terms of age. And if we look at that, like certainly their age patterns are reversed. So white evangelicals are very old, like they're nearly 30% are over the age of 65. 2/3 are over the age of 50, and essentially the opposite pattern is for the nones. So what we're saying is, if we think about what just happened, as I was telling Howard, a few miles away from my home on Wednesday, the attack on Congress, essentially what we're seeing is the last throngs of these ultra-conservative and pretty white supremacist movements looking for, like, you know, the last grasp of power and trying to hold as much as they can, because they're afraid of an America that it's secular and not white. And if we look at this chart, it actually shows you what's going on. Like, these people are afraid of what is coming. And the surveys have been saying it for years. But it's just that there was this assumption that people were just concerned about the growing racial diversity and secularization of the country, but not really were going to do anything about it. And this is the other thing that what I wanted to show is that politically, what is happening with the knowns is that they are much more united in terms of politics than by race than any other religious group. So if we think about, for example, Protestants, like we know that white Protestants and black Protestants have diametrically opposed politics. And so talking about Protestants, the Protestant voting bloc doesn't make sense because there's like a black voting bloc and a white Protestant bloc, which one is very Republican, the other is one that is very Democratic. The same with Catholics, in which like Latino Catholics and white Catholics actually vote in very different ways, which white Catholics being very Republican leaning and Latinx Catholics being overwhelmingly Democratic leaning. In the case of the non-religious, actually, if we see as their party IDs, most knowns identify as Democrats, and about like 1 in 5 or so identify as Republicans. And then those patterns are essentially repeated by every group. Blacks and Latinos, of course, are more likely to be Democrats than Republicans, but even white non-religious people are more likely to identify as Democrats than Republicans, and that is an exception of white people in the United States. Like white knowns are the only white people who actually are not majority Republican. And if we look at these, how the parties look, this is like self-ID in 2018, looking at the American Values Atlas. Like the knowns are the dominant cohort in the Republican Party. Sorry, in the Democratic Party. I'm looking at the wrong number. But essentially, like the ratio of Democrats to Republicans in each coalition is essentially 2 to 1. So there's like 2 Democrats for every Republican, not just in general, but also looking at how the Republican Party has very few knowns. And one of the interesting things over the years is that these numbers haven't, the ratios of Democrats to Republicans haven't changed much, and it has been mostly because a lot of the knowns who are more liberal leaning identify as independents. There's not a lot of, interestingly, there's not a lot of trust in the Democratic Party among knowns. They literally hate the Republican Party. So if you look at trust in the Republican Party or approval of the Republican Party, they're really low. But even among knowns who identify as Democrats, like that is not the case. They don't really like the Democratic Party that much. They're usually often Democrats because they don't like the Republicans, which is a phenomenon that just doesn't only happen with the knowns, but we also see these patterns of partisanship and low levels of trust in their own political party among Latinx people. And I think that's the result of having a 2-party system in which like one party you detest and the other one, well, it's what the hey, what are we gonna do? And closing there, so I want to go with political participation, and this is some of the misconceptions that we have about the knowns that I want to actually discussing here. This chart, I've been actually expanding it for 8 years now. So I started my first piece of this was in 2012, and like essentially every 2 or 4 years I write a new update of this piece. In this case, interestingly, what has happened is that this year, different sources have the secular vote in different places. I'm using, in this case, the exit polls, mostly because all the other data from previous years comes from the same place, and so I want to keep that kind of trend. But different sources have put the knowns either in the low 60s to the mid 70s in terms of their vote for Joe Biden in the last year. So essentially, the exit polls is kind of like also the middle ground in there, in which they have the knowns voting 65% to 31% for Trump over Biden. And this is interesting because this is the first time that it actually goes under 67% in probably like almost 20 years. The knowns had become increasingly democratic, and and also becoming less Republican in some of those years. And what has happened is that I'm not sure if what happened in this election is that we're going back to 2004. The last time that a Republican president was running for re-election was that year when George W. Bush did. And essentially a lot of people who are like probably conservative leaning or Republican leaning, essentially they're coming home because they were voting for re-electing a Republican, while in the previous election they weren't as excited to vote for that person because maybe they doubted their chances or they didn't think much was going to happen. So I think this is something that is explaining this boost in the Republican vote in 2020, which is something similar that probably happened with the Latinx vote in there, where there was that increased vote for Trump compared to 2016. But essentially what has happened is that there are two essential voting blocks in the secular community. Howard, you want to say something?
We had a question. Are you watching the chat? Scott asked.
Okay, sorry, I don't.
Bottom of your screen where it says chat.
Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong side of the screen. No, actually, it's not at the bottom of my screen. I'm trying to find the chat.
Okay. Well, anyways, while you're looking for that, Scott Hull's question is how likely are nuns to actually vote? More or less, or about the same as others?
Don't get ahead of yourself. I'm actually like 2 slides down.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't find the. Oh, sorry. Never mind. I found the chat. Okay, got it. Sorry. So there is. So this is the next slide.
Sorry.
It's okay. So here's the thing. Like, people say the knowns do not vote, and what happens is that there's a lot of analysis. You take the exit polls, and then you look at what's the proportion of the knowns in the general population, and you say, oh, well, so I'm using 2016 in here because I don't have the 2020 comparisons for the voter turnout yet. That data is not in yet with the vote validation and all the stuff that they do in the CCES. So I'm going to use 2016 for an example. I actually wrote this in a column for the humanist.com a few months back. So essentially, if we look at 2016, evangelicals accounted for 26% of the voters or something like that. And they were like about 17% of the population, according to like Pew or PRI. So that would mean that the voter turnout of the white evangelicals in 2016 was 84%, which is ridiculous, even when they are like, even accounting for the fact that white evangelicals are highly motivated voters. It's ridiculous that the voter turnout was 30% above the national average. And then if we take the same with the knowns, which accounted, I think, for 15% of the voters at that time, or at least 15% of exit poll respondents, and accounted for 25% of the population, 23, I think it was in 2016, that gives you a 34% turnout, which is ridiculously low. So when you read most of the columns that are talking about the known voter turnout and how like they don't vote, this is what you're talking about. But if you look at the one on the side, and I need to move my screen a little bit to look at it. This is from the CCES. This is the comparative congressional election study. They do this survey online pre and post election, and then they do a voter validation for the respondents. So if people say that they voted or not, and then they actually validate if people were actually in the voter files. And what they find is like, yeah, the national turnout doesn't change, it's 55%. But for people who identify as white evangelicals, 64% was the turnout, which is higher than your average American turnout, but it's not ridiculous at 30% higher. And for the non-religious, it's 51%. So it's lower than the average turnout, but it's not really ridiculous at 34%. And so, like, one of the things I've been talking about this year with different groups that, not this year, but last year, which now feels like an extension of last year. But what I was talking to several groups in 2020 is that if we think about, we need to stop talking about the nones not being a population that is politically active, because that is not true. I mean, they have lower turnout, but we have some reasons to explain why that is the case. We saw a little bit before when we were talking about the age differences between nones and white evangelicals, and the fact that like 2/3 of white evangelicals are over the age of 50 actually helps, like, and older people tend to have higher turnouts. Well, part of that is explained by that. They also have higher levels of party identification. So they're strongly Republicans to the extent that the nones are like, weak Democrats. So if we take into account those differences, like, we see that, the nones political participation can improve and should improve, but it's not that bad. And oh, my screen got frozen. I don't know why. There. Thank you very much. And then if we look a little bit more by age, this is like using the CCES, we see that the nones voter turnout actually improves by age and actually gets closer to white evangelicals if you divide them by age cohorts. But the problem is that the nones are so much younger that even people who, which again tend to have lower levels of party affiliation, are less motivated. That also affects. But if we look at the older cohorts, it's actually not that different. And so we need to take that into account, that we maybe need to do some improvements, like reaching out to our young people to vote, and also, like, maybe the parties need to do a better job in actually getting people excited about that. And again, this is another way of looking at it, the age distribution of the voters. So this is the people who said they voted, not just the general population. We look at the US and the evangelicals, they have a higher distribution of voters that are over 60. The nones, only 1/4 of voters are over 60. But the nones have twice the population under 30 that evangelicals have. And the young secular population, it's much younger than the U.S. population as a whole. So certainly we need to think a lot, not as that secular people or non-religious people don't vote, but actually what kind of people are non-religious, and how our organizations and how our groups can actually help to improve upon that. So not thinking that we have a voting turnout problem, because we have a slight turnout problem, but actually we need to, think about what are the limitations of our demographics that we need to improve upon. Maybe messaging, maybe mobilization, or maybe just wait until people get old. But one of the things that we also don't know is that, the nones are very politically active in general. So they're not much worse than the general population, but got a question from Howard. So how did Vote My Mail affect the ability of the nones to vote? I don't know that yet. I think once we get the 2020 comparisons of the CCES, in which they're going to ask people how they voted, and we're going to see differences in modes of voting, and certainly there was a higher turnout in the last election, so we're going to see how that varied by groups. I would have a clear picture of how that happened. But I would say probably improved the turnout. The question is whether it improved it to the extent that it was better than other groups, or comparatively better than other groups in previous years, or if it just improved similarly to everybody, for everybody in the country. I don't know that yet. But one of the other things that I wanted to get in these questions, I actually changed the wording a little bit so the charts will be a little more eye-friendly. So with Socioanalytica research last year, we did the 2020 Secular Voices Survey, and this was one nationally representative.
Hello?
And one of the questions that we asked.
Hello.
Yes. So it was nationally representative, and we asked the sample or the people who identified as not religious if they belong to one or several organizations that, you know, serve the secular movement. So it was AHA, CFI, FFRF, American Atheists. There was a list of like probably 7 or 8 plus like another one if we can think of one of those in that list, Anchor Student Alliance. And so about 26% of people say they were members at some point. That, I think it's high. I don't think 26% of secular Americans are actually members of the secular movement. But it's fairly consistent with the previous year, which also 26% did. So at least there's some validation. And the other thing is we actually didn't define what membership was. So if you're part of a, if you're part of a YouTube community, that counts. If you consider that your community, if you're a Facebook community, that counts. Or if you belong to a mailing list and you maybe think that that's membership, then like, so we didn't define membership as like dues paying members or anything like that, or people who attend meetings or something like that. So it's self-defined membership. But the number is fairly consistent in both years, so I feel good about it. And the other thing that we found is that we asked people about these different political activities, so registering voters, participating in marches, giving rights to people on election day, volunteering in campaign, and we asked them if they have done any of these in the past 12 months. Or if they have done it at some point. And so this is the question, if they have done it at any point in their lives, any of these activities. And as we can see, the people who identify as secular movement members, the people who say they have been a member at any point of any organization, are actually more active than Americans overall. So one of the interesting things is that we talk about the nones of being not voters and not politically engaged, but the people in the movement are essentially some of the most highly engaged people in the country. If you look at it, I did some comparisons with other groups, and it's amazing. And it's something that not only was found in this survey this year, it's something that we found, in 2020, but also in 2019, and other surveys like the CCES and the GSS that ask batteries similar to these ones. Have also find something like this, that especially in their case, they don't ask about people who belong in membership or in secular organizations, but people who identify as atheist or agnostic, which in these surveys are mostly a political label. Because you have a lot of people who say they're nothing in particular, and then they say they're non-theistic. But people who say they're atheist and agnostic are a special category, who say their religion is atheist or agnostic. And those people tend to be usually kind of like movement people or people who are more involved in politics. So that's the other thing I want to stress. Like, this is a population that is not totally disengaged. It certainly has a lot of issues have to do with age, but the other thing is that the people who are in the movement or who define themselves as being in the movement are people who are joiners, who are very active and who are very politically active. And to the extent that, one of the things that has happened, if we look at the voting patterns that we discussed at the beginning, is that, we don't think of the knowns as being a voting bloc that is organized. I consider it as organic voting blocks. These people have similar interests. They have similar disdain from one party. They have similar voting with their noses with another party. And there has been very little organization of them from the secular movement perspective. There's some things like the hashtag secular voter or atheist voter, and maybe some ads here and there. There's now a Center for Free Thought Equality, but the actual political capital put by organizations to organize these as a bloc has been very minimal. And it's interesting that it's organizations that are run by some of the strongest political activists in the country. And then I want to close with a few slides on leading public opinion, because that's the other thing. There's not much political power. There's only one member of Congress who identify as non-theistic. And there are a few who are like on the fence, but not enough to make 26% of Congress anyway. And there are like an increasing number of elected officials across the country, but certainly not enough to make it 26% of elected officials across the country. But there are some things that the knowns have been changing as they have increased. My favorite one is same-sex marriage, mostly because when I was at PRI, we did a lot of polling on same-sex marriage in those years. And we did a report at some point looking back at public opinion back in 2003, when the same-sex marriage started getting legalized across states. And in that year, only 32% of the U.S. population were in favor of same-sex marriage. 65% of non-religious people were in favor of same-sex marriage. So, like, non-religious people were there before it was cool, so to speak. By 2013, when the first time polls started registering majority support for same-sex marriage in the U.S. population, by that point, the secular people are about 75%, nearly 3/4 are in favor of same-sex marriage. So a lot of a few things happen in those intervening years. One of those is the increasing of the secular population, and as the secular population became more younger and more supportive of same-sex marriage, they were driving some of these numbers. So a lot of these increase in support of same-sex marriage in the country has a lot to do with the increase of the secular population and they becoming actually the driving this driving force in public opinion. Another thing that is happening is that, and that explains a lot of the attitudes toward political parties by the knowns, is that the public opinion of knowns is more liberal overall than the American population. And certainly that explains why there's so few Republicans comparatively, but also why there's this level of distrust of the Democratic Party. And it's because for the most part, the knowns are to the left of Democrats on most issues. So on issues like separation of church and state, like removing the phrase under God from the pledge, the knowns are certainly to the left of most Americans. The second point is the defund the police kind of like question of moving funding away from police and into agencies that do social services. The knowns are to the left of Americans. Removing religious exceptions to vaccination. And at the point that really the non-religious and Americans start to converge is on matters of climate change. It's, you know, a smaller gap, expanding government aid for people who need it. So, you know, the expansion of the welfare state, essentially, it's where the nones are kind of like leaving the American population. And we've seen, you know, mostly because millennial and Gen Z are actually pushing for those kind of changes. And so the nones are, you know, driving some of that public opinion. And so I want to close, and then like we can have some more questions. I see one more question there. I got a question from James Walter. With so many non-for so few members of secular groups like AHA, and I think I want to leave that to the end after I finish this. And I just have a couple of slides and a couple of points that I want to make. But I think this is a larger discussion that I think we all should have. I'm sorry, because it matters to all of us. And I was on daddy care duties today, so I'm running out of voice. Sorry about that too. So you know, so the point I want to you to take home is that, you know, so the nodes are becoming more, you know, they're having a larger sex parity. So there are an increasing number of women, and we didn't even get into, you know, non-binary people, LGBTQ people, sexual orientation, which are actually overwhelmingly non-religious. But the polling on those identities is a little all over the place, so I kind of like wanted to leave it out there. But that's also happening. Like LGBTQ people are more likely to be non-religious than any other group, and so that's also a driver of this growth. And of course, this racial diversity and continued growth among the young people, it's going to continue, and they're going to be becoming a larger part of the party coalitions. But one of the interesting things that is happening, and that I mentioned yesterday in another talk that I had, is that, you know, these events of January 6th, it's, you know, and the link of Christian nationalism to the whole attempted coup on last week may bring a lot of people to our fold, to the nones, because essentially, one of the drivers of secularization has been the politicization of religion, and to the extent that Christian nationalists keep giving us the favor of linking themselves to horrible policies, we're going to be probably continuing that trend of people disavowing religion rather than just disavowing this type of Christianity. On political participation, the nodes generally are supporting in political participation, the nodes are, you know, have really supported candidates for Democratic candidates for president, and sorry, I'm running out of steam. And, you know, I want you to think about the fact that most people are, you know, the nodes are not apathetic as their people think about them, but we need to think about the challenges that, especially generational, in terms of age, are happening. And of course, in terms of race, I mean, people of color who tend to have lower levels of trust in political parties are also becoming a larger part of the secular population, so that may also be affecting a lot of the turnout. And also the lack of attachment to political parties. But the nones are very politically involved, especially those who are involved in secular organizations. So I think we need to think about those organizations as drivers of change. And finally, you know, what we should expect an increase in numbers. The knowns are becoming a larger force in the Democratic Party. Particularly, they have presence in the 2020 convention. Give me 1 second. Apparently, I'm gonna. What about now, Howard? What about now? Okay. Had a little audio problem. So, you know, there was a presence of seculars in the 2020 convention. And, you know, there was the Organization of Humanists for Biden, which I actually was part of the advisory group that, in the creation of that group, with a few like humanist and secular leaders. The status of the knowns in the GOP, it's very uncertain because of the dominance of the Christian right and the white evangelicals, who certainly don't want people like us in there. But the knowns are going to be continuing leading public opinion, especially as the younger people who become more secular are you know, supporting these expanded welfare state policies, and essentially secular public opinion is going to continue be a major factor in how the American public opinion overall is going to look like. I want to thank you very much. A lot of this research you can find in the Secular Voices survey, and you can find you know, Socioanalytica research at Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram if you use those. At Socioanalytica, although more and more active at Twitter, because I'm not a big fan of Facebook or Instagram. But you know, the Twitter account is more active than the other two, and certainly my own Twitter account, Juhem Navarro, it's also there. But thank you very much, and I'm going to stop sharing, and you can ask me questions. I'm going to go back to that question on the secular movement. So with so many knowns, why there are so few members of secular groups like AHA? I think it has a lot to do with people first not knowing that there's a secular movement. A lot of people abandon religion, and you know, these are many individual choices happening that have accumulated. So we need to think about, like, you know, how much awareness of our movement there is, and then people may not know what this means. You know, maybe people don't join the American Humanist Association because they don't know what a humanist is. And they may be humanists, but they don't really know, you know, they may be a humanist in theory, in the sense that, you know, they have all the characteristics that we define as humanists, but they don't really know that there's a group that they can join. I think the level of awareness is probably very low. And then, like, you know, if you look at other groups like American atheists, like, maybe, you know, atheists as a word, as a concept, still is very stigmatized. So there's a lot of people who are gonna run away from there, run to American atheists. For example, CFI. What is the Center for Inquiry means? I mean, a lot of, to be in this movement, you have to be a lot in the weeds. It's what I mean, and so I think we need to understand that. For example, in my case, I've been openly non-religious for like almost 2 decades, since I was in my 20s, and I didn't really know about the movement until I was a researcher, and we did this survey, you know, the American Religious Identification Survey, and we found 15% of Americans were non-religious, and then I started getting requests from all these organizations. I didn't know they existed. Yes, Howard?
I was going to say, you and I have heard on the board, it's a matter of marketing. And the problem is you have to be able to find the people to market to. On our Facebook page, we have literally thousands upon thousands of people who are, online or free member Facebook members of the AHA. Translating that into paid membership, so we have the ability to go into DC and sit down with any of the elected officials and say, this is who we represent. That becomes the problem. And probably we have found that a good chunk of our members didn't know there was such a thing as humanism or the AHA until they were introduced to it by somebody else. And, if we could get every one of our members to go out and recruit 2 other people to become members of the AHA, we'd start growing. But it's a matter of getting able to market to the right community. And this has been a discussion. I've been on the board since 2011, and this comes up literally every meeting.
Yeah, and I would add that this is not a matter of marketing. Also, this is a matter of marketing. This is the matter of awareness and definition. So to my point, where I was like, I wasn't aware of this. Like as you say, like I learned from someone else, and that was probably Maggie Ardiente, who I think was at the time who was like handling communications. And actually, she was the first person from AHA I ever became acquainted with. But it's really hard when you are a person who comes from a religious background and you're abandoning a religion, and you literally have no network. I think probably the secular student alliances, which have shown the most growth, are the ones who are better equipped, mostly because they're in college campuses and they're still at that level of engagement. But in the general population at large, and we also need more, like, I've been doing this research now on my own, but we also need to invest more, like understanding who our people are, who our audience is. Like in the 2010s, there was a lot of literally throwing money away because I don't think there was anything. It never had the sense that it was very thought of or very well thought. Throwing billboards and like, I don't know how many millennials like are attracted by billboards. I mean, I try to ignore them when I'm driving, and I don't drive that often because like I live in a city and I don't have to. So I'm like, there's a level of disengagement between people who have money in the movement and people who want to do things that is, it's not just in our movement, but generally I think in me being a progressive, being involved in progressive politics for a few years, it's a major problem in general. But yeah, I think to the extent that we need to do a real assessment of who our audience is and how to reach them, and also understand that a lot of people who are in our potential cohort are in a lot of debt. I've been talking about this for years. Like, people need to understand that, if our growth is coming from the students, from the student secular, the secular student alliances, and those students are highly in debt by the time they leave college, they're not going to have the disposable income to support secular organizations. And so, we need to think also about that and that future. I have another question to your point. That many athletes, I'm assuming, is atheists, do identify strongly with one party or another. Many atheists are libertarians. Do libertarians, when given a choice, do they pick the Dem or Repub, or are there studies that look at category for knowns among libertarians? Libertarians. So, there's not that many surveys to do analysis of people who identify as libertarian. They usually pick others. So usually libertarians or Greens are in that other category of parties. They're mostly libertarians or Greens. There's evidence that the knowns are more likely to be libertarians or Greens than other people. And if we look at this part of presidential vote didn't include third-party votes in there. But the knowns are the most likely to vote for non-major party candidates in elections. So they were very likely to vote for Perot in 92 and 88. They were very likely to vote for Nader in 96 2000 and 2004. And they were very likely to vote for, oh my gosh, my memory is failing me, from your state, John Anderson in 1980. And they were more likely to vote for Jill Stein and Gary Johnson in 2016. But how much it is, I don't really know. I think it was in 2012, 2013, when I was at PRI, we did a survey where we tried to analyze libertarians, and they were more non-religious than other conservative-leaning people. So there's that, but that's to the extent of my knowledge.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions they want to ask?
I have one from James Walter. Sorry. I have talked to to some representatives about secular influence. These are Democratic reps. That makes sense. They say very little lobbying to them related to secular issues. Can we increase our political influence in the Democratic Party? Some of it is happening. There's a free thought caucus now, and Howard is a board member of the Center for Free Thought Equality, so he knows what's going on in there, which is the only secular PAC at this point. And it's a federal PAC. Sorry?
So we do have a representative from the center who does go and lobby the different representatives on various issues.
Our lobbying right now.
Right. And she's representing not just, when it gets down to it, not just the Center for Free Thought Equality, but she also is fronting for the Secular Coalition for America, which is the umbrella group for most of our organizations. So the problem is that a lot of the members in Congress don't want to talk to us. And it's a matter of getting pressure from their constituents to be able to get us to get in the door.
Yes, thank you, Howard. I knew you were more in the weeds in what the CFE was doing. So yeah, there's that, and but I think the other aspect that I think actually Howard and I had a very long discussion about that. The last time I think we met was in the Chicago meeting. It was how we get more elected officials, because for a long time, what the strategy was, there was no strategy. It was this expectation that as the knowns grew, a lot of members of Congress and elected officials were going to come out as secular themselves, and there was going to be this movement or this growth. That hasn't happened. And we had Pete Stark, who, by the way, very interestingly, Pete Stark, or the late Pete Stark, even though he was openly atheist by the end of his career, he was still not a non-religious member of Congress, because Pew defines those, he identified as a Unitarian, so he was not a non-religious member. and then Pew actually doesn't do theistic beliefs so there was no representation for atheists. Now we have Jared Hoffman is the only one who kind of like identify as humanist. He also doesn't come from the movement. I think he has been very gracious, and he has become a very immersed with us. He was involved in Humanists for Biden. Same with my congressman Jamie Raskin, who is like on the fence, a humanistic Jew, but still identifies as Jewish. But if we're gonna have like growth among elected officials, for example, we need to run for office, and we need to support people from our community. But what's gonna happen if these people come out? They don't really owe our community anything. So it's we need to show that we have a constituency that is running. We see that there's a lot of people who are active. I wish I had asked. I wanted to keep the trend, but people running for office in this movement. And I think if I get some money, I will try to do something like that. But I think that's one of the major issues, is that we don't have the lobbying money that other organizations have. Like, we don't even have a think tank. CFI calls itself a think tank, but they're not. I have told them many times. We cannot compete with the Heritage Foundation. We cannot compete with the other like crazy like Christian groups that are out there, that have fancy headquarters in here. I have Ajay Gupta. You were going to ask something?
Yeah, the question is that if nuns or humanists are a big block of voters, so if I were a politician, how could I exploit it to my advantage? And how, as a humanist, I will push back on my exploitation?
Can you repeat that? I didn't get the first part well.
So if humanists or nuns are a larger block now, how can a politician exploit it? And how can nuns avoid that exploitation?
So how politicians can exploit the larger number of nuns?
How could they fool us? How could they fool us to vote for them?
I mean, they have been doing it for years. It doesn't really matter.
Tell me, give an example.
I don't know in what sense you mean. Like, we have had to vote for Christians and Jews and Muslims and other politicians for years. It doesn't really matter. I think the question becomes, how do we get our interest getting there? And I think it has to do with showing clout, showing, organizing money. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of politics in this country is about money. We need to do fundraising. I don't think the Center for Free Thought Equality has, that kind of clout. I think in terms of agenda, it's supporting our agenda. Maybe a candidate that says that it's going to support a bill that we're interested in, and doesn't end up doing it, that's a way of fooling us. But I don't think that happens very often, because not many politicians talk to us. We are in the stage of nobody listens to us, not in the stage of people are betraying us. I think we need to get there at some point, maybe, if we're going to get somewhere. Howard, you want to say something?
Okay.
I kind of saw you. Okay, but yeah, but I mean, we need to increase our lobbying power, because I love Rachel. I really think the world of Rachel Ditch, but she's just one person representing a very diverse movement, which aligns in some issues, but it's literally one person with the religious right has an army fighting it.
We do have the Free Thought Caucus in the House, but unfortunately, we're only talking about 13 members.
Yes.
And it's not enough to be able to, at this point, present a wide swath of issues and bills for us to be able to try to change things, so we're trying. And we need that to grow. I mean, just here in Illinois, I got Sean Caston to join. We've been working on Bill Foster, who seems reluctant to come out as a free thought person. Raja Krishnamurthy has told me several times that he's planning on joining, but I've been hearing that for a year now. And I haven't had a chance to be able to sit down with Jan Schakowsky. No clue whether any of the other Chicagoland people like Brad Schneider are even interested, but we've been trying to do outreach to them. And to be honest, I'll throw that out to everybody here. If you have any kind of relationship with your Congress critter, get a hold of them and see if there's any way we can get them to join the Free Thought Caucus. Because keep in mind, the Free Thought Caucus doesn't mean you have to be a atheist agnostic. You can be a religious person, but be in favor of the idea of free speech and separation of church and state.
I mean, we have Rashida Tlaib in there.
Yes, exactly.
So yeah, and then that's and then just don't think about only Congress. I think that Congress is a shiny thing. Or it's a shiny
True,
thing on a shiny heel. I don't know.
We equivalent on the Senate side, is there?
Sorry?
Is there anything? There's no comparable caucus set up on the Senate side.
I don't think so.
At least I don't think there is. So, okay. Does anybody else have any questions for Juhem? Baku, if you go to Center for the I'm blanking out on it, the SCA, the Secular Coalition for America.
Right?
No, it's actually headed under SCA, is where you'll find information. If you go to Google Center, Secular Coalition for America, and you can find more information about the Free Thought Caucus there.
Oh, the Free Thought Caucus. Sorry. Yes.
So, anybody else have any more questions at this point? Anybody? I can't see everybody. If anybody's holding their hands up, I can't see everybody doing that. Simply, it's just not not everybody has their cameras on. So tell the Congress people that humanists are against what. I think that goes without saying. I think any human should be against what happened last Wednesday. So, anybody else have anything? Okay, then I guess we can wrap this up. And okay, you did above on a representative question. Okay, did we miss that? No, I think we got that.
How can we increase our political influence in the Democratic Party? I mean, it's happening slowly. I mean, we've been voting for Democrats for years. One thing that's been happening is that, especially in 2020, like finally the Biden campaign admitted that, secular people vote for him or were voting for Democrats, and they had these Humanists for Biden initiative. I was part of it. Royce Beckhart, Debbie Allen, Hemant, if we want to keep the locals, the Chicago locals. Hemant Mehta was there. I'm blanking. Greg Epstein organized the group. And yeah, so it's, we had some communications with the campaign. And the good thing is that we we were concerned that we were going to get attacked and maybe thrown under the bus. But that didn't happen. So I think that's a good sign, that there was no backlash against us, that there was no, our group officially launched the day before the debate, one of the debates. And somehow the talking points didn't get to Trump that, these Satanists were supporting Biden and was going to use it as a talking point. And then Biden not knowing that who the hell are these people. So that went well. But in general, I mean, I think that there's a lot of secular caucuses growing in the Democratic Party organizations in several states. There's a Facebook group, Secular Democrats of America, that you can join, and people are kind of like coordinating in there, so to speak, like talking, sharing stories. But in general, I think that's happening at different levels. Like people are trying to get involved at the state level, and this is kind of like a two-way street. Like if we don't show unafraid that we're essentially here, and we hold our ground and show the Democratic Party that we are an actual constituency here. We want to share some power. We want to have some influence. Like they're not gonna do anything. Party is not invested. The party's not invested in the status quo. They're not really interested in change, which is why, as a political scientist, when people ask like, oh, well, to some extent, the expansion of the electorate may help the Democratic Party, but at the same time, it may also increase the demands that they get from constituencies within the said party. So, like parties are not very invested in changing a status quo. And I think that's very hard for people to understand, that parties are not necessarily interested in expanding their base of support because, they can win elections with what they have, and they don't want to have another group of people demanding things from them and making them unhappy. So we need to work our way, and that is happening at state and local levels. And I think you're going to hear over the years that some of these things are happening. I know of secular Democrat groups in Texas, Arizona, Nebraska. So these are places that you wouldn't expect, with the exception of Arizona, except for Nebraska and Texas, as places where there's a good contingent of secular Democrats organizing. But it's happening. It's just a lot of this work is happening on the wraps. Or in very inside baseball kind of thing.
Anybody have anything else?
I just want to, what do you guys think about with Biden? Because he seems to be the most religious president we had since maybe Jimmy Carter. I mean, he's Catholic and all, but he's a practicing Catholic, and he seems to go along those lines. So it seems like we're actually going to have much more religion, possibly, in the White House than we even did under Trump, which was nothing. I see you shaking your head no. I know he hasn't come out, but...
No. I think Biden is more aware of the idea of separation of church and state than a lot have been, and I think I really do think he's going to respect that.
I agree with that, but I'm just saying he may not be the best president to push nuns under.
I mean, I don't know, like, we know what to expect from him. Like, he's been there, like, for a while.
Okay.
So the thing about Biden is there's not much surprise from him. Now to the, I don't know, like, in terms of, I mean, Biden didn't get Catholics to vote for him anyway. So, and I don't think Republicans are going to stop attacking him because he's a religion person. So, I mean, I don't think it's going to matter much. It's just going to show that you know, it's a person who respects separation of church and state that the nones voted for because, you know, so he was a Democrat, but also he didn't have any major red flags. I mean, certainly gonna pepper his language with religiosity, and it's probably gonna make sense because he actually knows what he's talking about, not randomly quoting or finding 2 Corinthians out of the blue. But I mean, I don't think it's gonna be a major issue or a setback for the non-religious population. I mean, it is it is what it is.
Okay, well, Juhem, I want to thank you tonight. Thank you for showing up tonight for talking to our group. It was very interesting. I learned a lot about the people I think we're going to be coming to rely on politically much heavier in the coming years. So I appreciate you being there and I appreciate you taking the time to share your knowledge and information with our group.
No, thank you, and you know, thank you for hosting me. I wish we could have done this in person because I can't. If there's one place I actually like to fly is to Chicago, so that didn't happen. So it was one of the trips I was looking forward when it happened, but it's you know, virtually it works. And you know,
we'll get you out here one of these days. So.
Huh?
So I said we'll get you out here one of these days.
I mean, I hope so. I literally, like I tell people, I didn't put my White Sox hat in here today, but I do have it in there.
Okay. Okay, well, I want to thank everybody for showing up tonight. It was an informative meeting, and glad to see that everybody is still alive and kicking. So thanks, everybody. If anybody wants to stay around and chat, we can do that for a little bit. Ewan, don't feel obligated to go ahead and, you know, because it's, you know, getting close to your bedtime, isn't it?